Black Hills, Dakota Territory. August 1883. The heat was a bully pressing down from a sheet metal sky and rising in shimmering waves from the baked earth. For 16-year-old Era, it was a false promise. She knew this heat was a fleeting tyrant, and its reign would be overthrown by a cold so absolute it could crack stone. Winter was the true king in this land, and it was coming. Her world had shrunk to the contents of a single scuffed leather trunk. Inside, nested between her mother's two good dresses and worn books, was a slim, oilskin-wrapped journal. It was her grandfather's. He had been a collier in the dark, damp belly of Wales, a man who understood pressure and rock. The journal, filled with his spidery script and strange angular diagrams, was all she had left of that world. 3 days prior, her stepfather had pointed a trembling finger at the door of the small cabin they had shared. Her mother, the soft light in their cramped lives, was gone, taken by a fever a month before. Without her, Ara was just another mouth to feed, a silent, watchful presence that reminded him of all he had lost. His words had been few and brittle. "You are not my blood. I cannot provide for you. Find your own way." And so she had walked. She had walked away from the only home she knew, the trunk bumping against her legs. The settlement of Providence, a haphazard collection of log cabins by the mud creek, had watched her go. She saw the pity in some eyes, the judgment in others. A young woman, alone with winter on the horizon. No one offered a room. No one offered a meal. They offered only the cold calculus of frontier survival. She was not looking for charity. She was looking for a chance. Her search ended 2 miles south of the settlement, where the prairie buckled into a series of low rolling hills. One hill in particular caught her eye. It faced due south, a perfect orientation to catch the low winter sun. A small, clear stream curled around its base, a lifeline of fresh water. Here she stopped. This would be the place, not where she would build, but where she would dig. The idea was not born of desperation, but of memory. She remembered her grandfather's stories told by her mother. He spoke of the earth as a living thing, a beast that held the summer's heat deep in its flesh. He spoke of the mines which were cool in the summer and maintained a survivable temperature in the winter. He called it the breathing of the stone. Her stepfather believed a home was something you built log by log, fighting gravity to raise walls against the sky. They would spend their autumns felling trees and chinking gaps with mud, a frantic race against the first frost. Ara looked at the hill and saw a different path. Her grandfather's journal confirmed it. Tucked in the back was a section on what he called the GU. In his Welsh tongue, it meant wall or bed. It was a way of making the very earth your primary wall, your ultimate shield. She would not build a house. She would excavate one. She would burrow into the hillside, creating a dugout. If you enjoy historical survival stories and want to see how Era's journey unfolds, make sure to subscribe to my channel. Hit the bell icon for more such content. Thanks for watching.
But it would be more than a simple cave. Her grandfather's journal showed a design that was both radical and brilliantly simple. It was a home built not just to shelter from the cold, but to actively harvest and store heat. First, she used the small spade and pickaxe traded for a silver locket her mother had given her to mark out the dimensions. A rectangle 12 ft wide and 18 ft long carved into the face of the hill. The work was brutal. The prairie sod was a dense, unforgiving blanket 2 ft thick in places woven with 1,000,000 years of grass roots. She learned to cut it into large, heavy bricks, piling them carefully to one side. These would be her building blocks later. Beneath the sod was a dense layer of clay and earth. Day after day she dug. The sun beat down and her hands, soft from a life of domestic chores, blistered, bled, and then hardened into calloused leather. Her back acted with the fire she had never known. The pile of excavated earth grew into a small mountain beside her burgeoning cavity. People from the settlement riding out to check their snares or herd their few cattle would stop and stare from a distance. They saw a lone girl filthy with dirt digging a hole in the ground. Their expressions shifted from pity to a kind of derisive amusement. They called it Ara's folly. The name traveled through Providence on whispers and chuckles. The child had clearly been broken by her grief. Digging her own grave, some said it was a sad, strange spectacle. One afternoon a shadow fell over her work. She looked up, squinting into the sun, to see a large man on a stout horse. It was Silas Blackwood, the man who had built half the cabins in Providence. He was the town's master carpenter, a man whose pronouncements on the art of shelter were taken as gospel. He was broad, bearded, and carried the unshakable confidence of a man who worked with plumb bobs and spirit levels, who imposed order on the wilderness with his axe and saw. He dismounted, his boots sinking slightly into her pile of fresh earth. He surveyed her hole in the ground, the neat stacks of sawed bricks, the sweat streaking the dirt on her face. He did not look amused, he looked offended. "Child," he began, his voice a low rumble of authority. "What do you think you are doing?" Leaned on her spade, taking a moment to catch her breath. "I am building my home, Mr. Blackwood." He let out a short, sharp laugh that was more of a bark. This is a root cellar, a den for a fox. You cannot live in the ground. The damp will get into your bones. The frost will heave the walls and it will collapse on you in your sleep. It is a coffin of rock and mud." She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "The earth is warmer than the air, sir." "That is a fool's notion," he snapped, his patience already wearing thin. "A log home properly chinkicked with a good stone fireplace. That is how a man survives a Dakota winter. You are raising no walls, you have no foundation. You are digging a pit. You will die in this hole." Grandfather's journal. Of the careful diagrams showing airflow and heat transfer. She thought of his words about the Earth's thermal constancy. She was tired, sore, and in no mood to argue with a man whose mind was as square and rigid as the log homes he built. "My walls will be 2 ft of sod and 50 ft of earth," she said quietly. "Yours are 8 in of wood. I think I will be warmer." Silas Blackwood stared at her, his face flushing with anger at her insolence. At this girl-child challenging the core tenets of his craft. He saw not a builder, but a deluded orphan succumbing to madness. "You are a liability," he said, his voice hard. "When the first blizzard hits and you are freezing or starving in this mudhole, you will expect the good people of Providence to risk their lives to come and save you. We will not. You are making your choice. You will lie in the grave you are so busy digging." He turned without another word, swung himself onto his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and condemnation in his wake. Ara watched him go, then turned back to her work. She picked up the shovel. He was not wrong about the risk, but he was wrong about everything else. She had another part to her plan, the most crucial and most baffling part to any outside observer. Once the main chamber of her home was excavated to a depth of 8 ft at the back, sloping up to a 7 ft entrance, she began a new, stranger excavation. Starting from the spot where her small cast-iron stove would sit near the front corner of the dugout, she began digging a tunnel. Not up as a chimney should go, but horizontally. She dug a trench 2 ft wide and 2 ft deep, extending not from the back of the cave but running parallel to the front wall and then snaking out and away from the entrance, 40 ft across the face of the hill. It was a long, shallow, gently inclined ditch. This was the part that truly sealed her reputation as mad. A trapper who saw her digging the long, pointless trench simply shook his head and hurried away, convinced she was now digging trenches for a phantom army. But for a heart of the entire design, this was the GU. Into this trench she began painstakingly laying stones she had gathered from the creek bed. She built a long hollow channel, a stone-cased tunnel, carefully mortaring the stones with a thick slurry of clay and grass. It was slow, arduous work. Once the stone channel was complete, capped with flat flagstones, she buried it, packing the earth back on top until the ground looked almost undisturbed, save for a small stone-lined opening 40 ft away from her front door. This distant hole, no bigger than a stovepipe, would be her chimney. The narrative of her folly was now complete in the minds of the townsfolk. The girl had dug a cave and then buried her chimney. It was beyond foolish. It was a perversion of common sense. Fire needed to draw. Smoke needed to rise. Everyone knew that. Silas Blackwood, hearing the news, felt a grim satisfaction. He had warned her. Now nature itself would teach her the lesson. Her fire would never light, or it would fill her well with smoke and suffocate her. It was a tragedy of her own making. As autumn began to paint the prairie in shades of rust and gold, Ara's work continued. She framed the entrance of the dugout with thick timbers salvaged from a lightning-struck cottonwood. She laid a floor of flat stones. The front wall was built from the sawed brick she had so carefully saved. They were heavy, dense, and she stacked them too deep, staggering the seams like a bricklayer. She left a small opening for a window, which she would cover with a greased animal hide, and a larger one for a door she fashioned from the remains of the cottonwood. The roof was a thick lattice of smaller branches covered with prairie grass, and then topped with the remaining sod bricks laid grass side up. In time, the roots would reknit, and her home would become an indistinguishable part of the living hillside. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of damp earth and clay. It was dark, but it was a sheltering dark. She installed her small stove, connecting the pipe to the entrance of her buried stone flue. Her home was ready. It was not a cabin. It was not a house. It was a den, a burrow, a human nest woven into the fabric of the earth.
She had her shelter. Now all she could do was wait for the king to arrive.
Let us pause here for a moment and step away from Ara's solitary struggle. Let us become the narrator, the observer who can see the unseen forces at play. To understand the genius of what the people of Providence called folly, we must understand the physics of survival, the unforgiving laws of thermodynamics that governed every life and death on that frontier. Consider the home of Silas Blackwood. It was, by the standards of the day, a masterpiece, hewn from thick pine logs, each one squared and notched with a master's precision. The gaps were chinked with a mixture of clay and horsehair that had hardened like stone. It had a beautiful large fireplace built from river rock, a testament to his skill and prosperity. It was the very image of safety and warmth, but it was a thermodynamic sieve. It was a machine designed unintentionally to be cold. The primary enemy in a Dakota winter is not just the low temperature, but the relentless loss of heat. Heat, like water, always seeks to move from a place of high concentration to a place of low concentration. The battle for survival is a battle to slow this movement down. The effectiveness of a shelter is measured by its resistance to this heat transfer, a concept we now call R-value. The thick 8-in log walls of Silas's cabin had an RV value of approximately 8. It was better than a canvas tent, to be sure, but it was a woefully inadequate shield against a wind that could feel like a physical blow. Furthermore, his magnificent fireplace was an accomplice to the cold. As the fire roared, it consumed vast quantities of air which it drew from the room. This created a powerful draft. Cold, dense outside air at 30 or 40 degrees below zero was pulled into the house through every tiny, unavoidable crack around the door, the window frames between the floorboards. The family would huddle near the fire, their fronts roasting, while their backs felt the icy fingers of this incoming draft. The fire gave them radiant heat, but it did so at the cost of filling their home with Arctic air. And the heat it produced, the vast majority of it, perhaps as much as 90%, went straight up the chimney, a plume of wasted energy painting a fleeting signal of life against a merciless sky. The fire was not heating the house. It was heating the Dakota territory. To stay warm, Silas had to feed the beast constantly. His woodpile, which looked immense in October, would become a source of growing terror by January. Now consider Ara's dugout. Her home was an exercise in radical efficiency. Her primary building material was the earth itself. The thick sod bricks of her front wall, combined with the packed soil behind them, provided an insulation value that was difficult to calculate, but exponentially higher than Silas's logs. But the true genius was in the thermal mass. The sheer uncalculated tonnage of earth surrounding her living space acted as a massive thermal battery. Throughout the long hot summer and the mild autumn, the ground had been absorbing solar energy, storing it deep within. The Earth's temperature, a few feet below the frost line, remains remarkably constant, hovering in the low 50s Fahrenheit year-round. While the air outside might swing over 100 degrees from summer to winter, the Earth maintained its slow, steady equilibrium. Home was not exposed to the brutal, wind-chilled air on four sides. It was intimately coupled with this enormous, stable reservoir of stored warmth. The Earth wasn't something to be kept out. It was the very thing that would keep her warm. It was a slow-release furnace that had been charging for 6 months, and her chimney, her buried goo, this was the active part of the system. the masterstroke her grandfather had sketched in his journal. It was a counterflow heat exchanger of profound simplicity. When she lit a small fire in her stove, the hot exhaust gases, smoke, and superheated air did not vent immediately into the atmosphere. Instead, they were forced to take a long 40-foot journey through the stone-lined tunnel, buried just beneath the surface of the ground near her home. As these hot gases, which could be several hundred degrees, traveled through the flue, they were in direct contact with the cool stone. The laws of thermodynamics took over. The heat flowed from the hot smoke to the cooler stones, which readily absorbed the thermal energy. The stones in turn passed this heat into the dense surrounding earth. By the time the smoke finally exited the flue 40 ft away, it had been stripped of most of its heat. It emerged as a cool, lazy wisp, having paid its rent as her grandfather's journal described it. Ara had effectively moved her chimney from the roof to the floor. The heat, instead of being wasted to the sky, was being pumped directly into the thermal battery of the earth that constituted the walls and floor of her home. The ground beneath and around her became a massive, gentle, radiant heater. It wouldn't make the room hot and stuffy. It would raise the ambient temperature of the entire structure, creating a stable, livable environment. She didn't need a roaring fire. She needed only a small, steady one to keep the thermal battery charged. Her consumption of firewood would be a tiny fraction of what was needed in a conventional cabin. Silas Blackwood saw a girl digging a grave. The universe, however, saw a brilliant young engineer applying forgotten principles of thermodynamics with a courage and clarity her entire community lacked. They saw madness, physics saw wisdom. The coming winter would be the final impartial judge. The first snows came in late October, a gentle dusting that served as a polite warning. By mid-November, the warnings were over. The king had arrived. The sky dropped like a wall of gray slate, and the wind began its long, mournful song. Winter clamped its jaws on the Dakota territory and refused to let go. The old-timers would talk about the winter of 1883. For the next 50 years, it was not just a cold winter, it was a siege. Blizzards rolled in one after another, burying the prairie in layers of fine, dry snow that the wind sculpted into monstrous drifts. The temperature plummeted and stayed there for weeks on end. It did not rise above zero. At night, it would sink to 20, 30, even 40 degrees and below. The mercury in the thermometers froze. It was a cold that was personal, an active predator that sought every crack, every weakness, every moment of inattention. In Providence, life ground to a halt. The world was reduced to the space between the cabin and the woodpile. For Silas Blackwood, that space became a battlefield. Each trip for more logs was a brutal, punishing ordeal. The wind tore at his clothes and the cold burned his exposed skin like a brand. His magnificent cabin, the pride of his life, had become his prison and his enemy. The cold found its way in everywhere. It radiated from the single-pane glass window, which was now a solid, opaque block of intricate frost. It seeped through the floorboards. It poured down the chimney when the fire died down. The family lived in a small, shrinking circle of survivable warmth around the perpetually hungry fireplace. His wife and 2 small children were always cold. They slept in their coats, huddled together under a mountain of blankets, and still they shivered. The water in the barrel by the door was frozen solid. The potatoes in the root cellar were frozen solid. Fear, cold and hard as the ice on the windows, began to settle in Silas's heart. His woodpile was disappearing at a terrifying rate. He had cut what he thought was more than enough, but he had never contended with a cold this relentless. He was burning through it twice as fast as he had anticipated. He started rationing, letting the fire die down to embers during the day, forcing the family to endure a bone-chilling cold to conserve wood for the deadly nights. The joy and pride he once felt in his home had curdled into a bitter, helpless anger. The house was failing. His expertise, his knowledge, his entire identity as a master builder felt like a fraud. He had built a beautiful, sturdy trap. 2 miles away, inside the hill, was not merely surviving. She was comfortable, her world was quiet, still and warm. The raging blizzard outside was a distant, muffled roar, the fury of a beast that could not reach her. The temperature inside her dugout hovered at a steady 60 degrees. The earth around her, charged by her modest fires, radiated a gentle, pervasive warmth. The walls were not cold to the touch. The floor, packed tight with clay and straw, held a quiet warmth, like it remembered every fire she had ever lit. Ara moved barefoot across it, her breath steady, her hands calm. No shivering, no panic, just control. Above her, the storm screamed. Below, there was silence. She adjusted a small vent, letting just enough air feed the low-burning fire. Not too much, never too much. She understood something Silas never did. Heat isn't just created, it's preserved. Days turned into weeks, the blizzards didn't stop. In Providence, desperation grew teeth. Silas Blackwood stood at his door one morning, staring at what remained of his woodpile. It wasn't enough, not even close. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from something worse. Realization. He had built against nature. Someone else who had built with it. That same day, through a curtain of snow, he saw it. A faint line of smoke rising from the hillside. Weak, thin, but alive. Dragging his exhausted body through waist-deep drifts, he followed it. Every step felt like a surrender of pride, of certainty, of the man he thought he was. When he finally reached the entrance, he hesitated. Then knocked. The door opened slowly. Ara stood there, warm light behind her, calm eyes meeting his storm-broken ones. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Silas whispered, barely audible, "I was wrong." Ara stepped aside. "Come in." Inside, the air wrapped around him like something unreal. His frozen skin burned as it thawed. His lungs filled without pain for the first time in weeks. Behind him, his family followed, stepping out of a world that wanted them dead into one that had been designed to keep them alive. Silas looked around at the curved walls, the low ceiling, the quiet fire. No grandeur, no pride, just understanding. That winter did not end quickly, but it ended differently for those who learned. Years later, when people spoke of the great winter of 1883, they didn't just talk about the cold. They talked about the girl in the hill, the one they called foolish, the one who listened when no one else did. Because in the end, nature doesn't reward strength, it rewards respect. And the ones who survive are the ones who learn to bow before they try to build.